Well, welcome to the last of our Bible studies in this present series, looking at the life of Jesus. This brings us to the real climax of the story of Jesus as we consider his passion and resurrection. I think the first thing to say is, as we have done in the past, we need to link back to the Old Testament to really understand where Jesus was coming from, and to understand this part, very important part, of the story. Jesus seems to be identifying himself with a figure in Isaiah's prophecy, which is usually known as the suffering servant. Let me just quote a couple of verses from that, and you'll see what I mean. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that made us whole, and with his stripes we are healed. And then a little later in the 53rd chapter of Isaiah's prophecy, we have the words, "Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for transgressors." Of course, at the time of Jesus, the expectations of the Messiah were more to do with a military victory over the Romans who had taken over the land of Palestine. And people wanted a Messiah that would be like King David and would cast out the enemies of God as they saw them. Yet Jesus didn't identify at all with that kind of thing. In fact, at one point we're told the crowds came to make him king, and he sort of ran away from that idea. When he was talking to the Pharisee Nicodemus, who came to him by night, the same sort of theme comes up. And Jesus says to Nicodemus, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God sent the Son into the world, not to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. He who believes in him is not condemned. He who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God." Perhaps the next thing we need to ask ourselves is how have Christians understood what the lifting up of Jesus on the cross actually means for believers. So very briefly, I'd like to just mention several ways in which this has been historically understood by theologians. Some of the very early fathers of the church had what you could call the Fishhook theory of salvation. And it went something like this. The devil was out to get Jesus and to hang on to mankind. And when Jesus offered himself up on the cross, it was a bit like offering a bait to a fish. And Satan took the bait and found himself hooked, and therefore mankind was able to escape. I don't think that's a theory that's particularly prevalent today, but it certainly was popular in the earlier period. In the Middle Ages, another theory was quite popular. Anselm, for example, argued this. He said that Jesus was totally righteous, and so the death of Jesus on the cross was an act of unrighteousness. It was something that should never have happened to a righteous person. And the fact that Jesus went through it kind of gave him extra points, if you like. And he didn't need these extra points because he was already fully righteous. And so God in his grace gave the extra points to us instead. And then there is another idea which has been current, really, certainly in the Protestant understanding of things, and also you can find it in St. Paul, and that's the idea of what might be called penal substitution. In other words, we deserve to be punished, but Jesus stepped up and took our punishment for us. Now, I would suggest that there are psychological ramifications for us in the whole archetypal idea of death and resurrection, which we see in the story of Jesus. And the inferences are this: we as human beings find it very difficult to get a sense of who we are. A sort of battle rages between our natural drives and urges and that which society requires of us in terms of how we behave. And it's from the struggle between those two things that a sense of who we are, or you could put it in Freudian terms, say the ego, emerges. And it's fragile, this thing. It's a bit like Peter trying to walk on water in one of the gospel stories. But it's not the whole story. We're much larger than what we imagine our ego to be. And in order to discover that greater sense of self, the ego has to suffer a kind of passion. And of course this links to the whole idea of Jesus dying on the cross in order to rise again, to bring a new and more developed and wider humanity into existence through his death and resurrection. And perhaps when we meet on Tuesday we can take this idea further and look at it in more depth. So finally we come to the resurrection. Now it's fine to think about death and resurrection in the story of Jesus from a psychological point of view or an archetypal point of view, but it's not enough to just do that. There are plenty of stories of dying and rising, or wounded and then healed heroes in all sorts of ways in cultural stories. Clearly the Gospels intend us to understand something more than that, although the psychological ramifications are important. It's quite difficult when we look at the resurrection narratives to kind of harmonise them and make them all make sense. But what is clear is that all the Gospel writers intend us to believe that Jesus, who died on the cross and was buried, rose again. Now, what are we to make of this? Well, our problem in the West is that since the days of the Greek philosophers, right the way up to the present, we've been infected by a kind of dualism which sees body as one thing and spirit as something else. Now, the ancient Greek philosophers really saw the world, the physical world, as being sort of a root of evil in a way, and that the spirit was what was important and what was eternal. And when we come to look at the stories from the Gospels, the trouble is we often look at them, as it were, through those kind of glasses and get us into all sorts of problems. For Jewish thinking, spirit and body were a unity. At the beginning, God made Adam and breathed into him, and he became a living soul. He didn't have a soul inside a body, like as it were, the life of a machine. He was a living soul, and part of that was being physical. And so the writers, being Jewish, of course, all claim that Jesus rose physically. And then we've got the evidence of the empty tomb. What do we really make of that? St. Paul struggled with this idea because he understood both Greek and Jewish thought, and he couldn't bear the idea, because it was a Jew, of spirits sort of floating around with no body. And so he talks about the fact that we are given a spiritual body to inhabit after death. The bodily resurrection, of course, is rather difficult for us, but it means a lot more than just the resuscitation of the corpse. That again gets us into this kind of dualism, which really isn't very helpful when it comes to trying to understand the Bible. And I've been interested recently in reading new research about the Turing Shroud, which was always considered to be some sort of fake. But there's been some really interesting research done on that, and particularly by a Jewish professor, actually, on how the image came to be on that particular piece of cloth. And they found that on the cloth there's pollen of flowers that are only found in the Jerusalem area. And because they can go much deeper into the image than they ever could before, they found evidences of what the woundings were of the person that was wrapped in this shroud, and it's very close to what the New Testament describes as the sufferings of Jesus. So what we're to make of all that, I don't know, but it is an interesting theory. But the idea of bodily resurrection is important because it's part of our wholeness. Now, quite how that works out, I don't know, but it is important. Bishop Mick, Bishop of Croydon, was in a conference. I was at a conference with him in Germany, and somebody asked him what heaven was like. And he said, I haven't got a clue what heaven's like. And this person said, well, it's a bit much, isn't it? You're a bishop of the church, you should know what heaven's like. And he said, I don't know what heaven's like. He said, but I do believe in a God who raises the dead. And for now, that's enough.